Countries that teach children about this topic openly and without shame have dramatically lower rates of teen pregnancy, lower rates of assault, and teenagers who report significantly higher satisfaction in their relationships. Countries that don't talk about it, that wrap it in silence and shame, have the opposite outcomes. Let that sit for a second. The thing we refuse to discuss openly is not made safer by the silence. The silence makes it worse. So today, we're going to talk about it, clearly, honestly, and without flinching. Not to be provocative, but because the question of why human sexuality became taboo is one of the most revealing questions you can ask about power, psychology, history, and what it means to be human. In this video, we're going to move through 4 lenses. What evolutionary biology actually tells us about why social rules around sexuality exist at all. How religion, culture, and the mechanics of power shaped and weaponized those rules over centuries. What psychology has discovered about shame, desire, and why suppression tends to backfire. And what ancient spiritual traditions understood about sexuality that modern culture largely forgot. This isn't a video designed to shock. It's an honest attempt to understand something most of us were never given the tools to think about clearly. Let's start with the biology, because the story begins much earlier than most people realize. Here's something that tends to stop people. Shame about sexuality is not biologically hardwired. No other animal experiences it. We are the only species that developed elaborate systems of rules, prohibition, and punishment around reproduction, which raises an obvious question. Why us? From a purely biological standpoint, sexuality exists to pass genes forward. The drives, the attractions, the pair bonding instincts, all of it evolved because it served that function. But humans also evolved something no other species has to the same degree: a prefrontal cortex capable of complex social reasoning, long-term planning, and moral judgment. And we are intensely social animals. Our survival has always depended on group cohesion. Sexuality, by its nature, creates social complexity. Questions of paternity, pair bonding, jealousy, and resource allocation all emerge from it. Anthropologists and evolutionary biologists have proposed that some regulation around sexuality may have emerged as a byproduct of being social animals who needed to maintain group stability. Some regulation is a long way from centuries of silence, shame, and punishment. Biology may explain why rules around sexuality exist. It does not explain the particular shape those rules took, who they punished, who they protected, and whose interests they served. For that, we have to look at history, and what we find there is not comfortable. The history of sexual shame is, in many ways, the history of power. Control reproduction, and you control inheritance. Control inheritance, and you control property. Control property, and you control populations. The people who held power throughout history understood that intuitively and built systems to enforce it. Systems that are still running, largely invisibly, in many of our cultural assumptions today. This is the part that surprises most people. Many ancient cultures had far more open relationships with sexuality than the societies that followed them. Ancient Greece, Rome, Egypt, India, and Japan all produced art, literature, medicine, and religious practice that treated sexuality as a natural, and in many cases sacred, dimension of human life. The Kama Sutra, written in India between the 2nd and 4th centuries CE, was not primarily a manual of technique. It was a philosophical text about living fully, and sexuality was one chapter in a much larger inquiry. Temple carvings across South and Southeast Asia depict explicit scenes not as obscenity, but as expressions of divine creative energy, the union of opposites as a cosmic principle made visible. As organized religion gained political power and centralized states expanded their reach, the rules around sexuality became more rigid, more punishing, and more specifically targeted. In much of the Western tradition, the body itself became suspect. Sexuality became associated with weakness, sin, and the corruption of the immortal soul, particularly outside of marriage, and particularly, it's worth noting, for women. This wasn't purely theological. The control of women's sexuality was the control of paternity. The control of paternity was the control of bloodlines. The control of bloodlines was the control of land, title, and inheritance. What made this system so effective and so durable was that it didn't just create external rules, it created internal ones. When shame becomes attached to a behavior, people don't need to be monitored. They monitor themselves. They internalize the prohibition. They pass it to their children. Shame, in this sense, is one of the most efficient tools of social control ever developed. You don't need guards when people have been taught to be their own. Most of us alive today are the inheritors of these systems. Whether we practice religion or not, whether we identify with the cultures that built them or not. The discomfort, the silence, the reflexive sense that the body is something to be managed rather than inhabited, these have roots that go far deeper than our personal histories. Here is a finding that behavioral researchers keep arriving at, and that most people find genuinely counterintuitive. Shame does not reduce sexual behavior. In many documented cases, it increases it, and specifically increases riskier forms of it. Psychologists have documented what's called the ironic process, the tendency for attempted thought suppression to produce a rebound effect. Tell someone not to think about something, and they think about it more. This is not a failure of willpower, it is a structural feature of how the human mind works. Applied to sexuality, shame doesn't neutralize desire, it drives it underground. And desire that has gone underground doesn't disappear. It simply becomes disconnected from the self-awareness, communication, and care that make intimate relationships healthy. Researcher Brené Brown's work on shame draws a critical distinction. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am something wrong. When shame becomes attached to sexuality, one of the most fundamental dimensions of human experience, it doesn't just affect behavior, it affects identity. The sense that there is something wrong with you at a level you cannot fix. The research consistently associates sexual shame with higher rates of anxiety, depression, difficulty in relationships, and paradoxically, higher rates of the very behaviors the shame was meant to prevent. For decades, the Netherlands has taken an approach to sexuality education that is almost the opposite of shame-based models. Beginning in early childhood with age-appropriate, factual, non-judgmental conversations about bodies, boundaries, consent, and relationships. The outcomes are striking and well documented. Dutch teenagers have significantly lower rates of teen pregnancy and sexually transmitted infections than their peers in countries with abstinence-focused approaches. They also reported higher rates of relationship satisfaction and are more likely to describe their first sexual experiences as wanted and positive. Less shame did not produce more recklessness, it produced more thoughtfulness, more agency, more care. What if the question we've been asking, how do we control this, has been the wrong question all along. What if the right question is, what does healthy sexuality actually look like, and what conditions does it require? Almost every cultural, religious, and institutional approach to sexuality has centered on the same goal: control. But control of what exactly? And for whose benefit? Research in relationship psychology consistently finds that sexual intimacy at its healthiest is inseparable from vulnerability, trust, honest communication, and mutual care. It is one of the primary mechanisms through which humans form and sustain deep bonds. When shame surrounds it, those conversations become harder to have. The mechanism that could bring people closer becomes a source of distance, confusion, and silence. The thing that requires the most trust becomes the thing least safe to be honest about. There is also a pattern in the data worth naming directly. The societies most punishing around sexuality are not, by any measurable standard, the ones with the healthiest outcomes. They do not have lower rates of sexual violence, more stable families, or happier people. In many cases, the correlations run the other direction, which means that shame as a strategy is not achieving what it claims to be achieving. Something else is happening, and to understand what, we have to go to a place most modern conversations about sexuality never reach. Here is something that tends to surprise people. Many of the same ancient traditions that later developed the most punishing attitudes towards sexuality also contain, within their own text and mystical lineages, a radically different understanding. One that treats sexuality not as a problem to be suppressed, but as a doorway to something sacred. In the Tantric traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism, sexual energy, called Kundalini or Shakti, is understood as a manifestation of the same creative force that underlies all existence. The goal is not suppression, but transformation, learning to channel and refine that energy toward deeper states of consciousness and connection. The sacred marriage, the union of masculine and feminine principles as a cosmic act, appears independently in ancient Sumeria, Kabbalah, alchemy, Celtic spirituality, and Gnostic Christianity. It is one of the most recurring images in the mystical imagination. The idea that union itself reflects something fundamental about the nature of reality. Even within mainstream Christianity, the mystical tradition produced the Song of Solomon, a text of striking erotic imagery included in the Hebrew Bible, and figures like Hildegard of Bingen, who used the language of divine love in ways that blur any clean line between the spiritual and the sensual. What these traditions share is a view of the body as a vehicle for the sacred rather than an obstacle to it. Not a source of corruption, but a site of potential transformation. This is not a fringe position. It is in various forms one of the oldest spiritual understandings human beings have held. The shame-based framework that came to dominate is the historical newcomer. Some teachers in these traditions suggest that the taboo around sexuality, for all the harm it has caused, is pointing, however clumsily, at something real. Sexual intimacy involves radical vulnerability. It is one of the few experiences in which the self becomes genuinely permeable to another. That is powerful. It deserves to be taken seriously. The error in this view was not taking it seriously. The error was taking it seriously in the wrong direction, toward control and shame rather than toward care and reverence. There is a meaningful difference between treating something as dangerous and treating it as sacred. Both recognize that it matters, but they lead to entirely different places. So why did sexuality become taboo? Biologically, because we are social animals, and reproduction creates complexity that groups have always felt compelled to manage. Historically, because controlling sexuality was one of the most effective tools available for controlling people, property, and populations, and those who held power used it deliberately. Psychologically, because shame is one of the most efficient mechanisms for regulating behavior ever developed, even when, perhaps especially when, it causes more harm than good. And spiritually, because sexuality touches something so fundamental, so close to the center of what it means to be alive, that almost every human tradition felt it required a framework. The tragedy is not that we took it too seriously, it's that so many of the frameworks we built caused so much unnecessary suffering. Shame has been the dominant approach for a very long time. The evidence suggests it isn't working. Maybe it's time to ask better questions. I want to know where you landed on this. Was there a part that genuinely surprised you? Something you disagreed with? Something that rang true in a way you didn't expect? The comments on this one are going to be interesting. I'll be reading them. If you're new here, the first 2 videos on this channel go just as deep. Eye color and ears. Both are linked below. And the next video takes everything we explored today, the idea that sexuality is something sacred rather than shameful, and goes somewhere even deeper. We're looking at what intimate connection actually does to the human being at a neurological, psychological, and spiritual level. What the neuroscience reveals, what the Tantric traditions mapped 2,000 years ago, and why the gap between what genuine connection is capable of and how it is most commonly expressed may be one of the most significant sources of human suffering in the modern world. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. Thanks for watching.